The second chapter of Dr. Zhivago is titled "A Girl from a Different World," and it's about the early life of Lara, who is the moral compass of the novel. Lara's mother is financially dependent upon a man named Komorowski, who takes advantage of the situation and takes advantage of Lara. She's completely dominated by him, and eventually she will break from him. But in the meantime, it says Lara was not religious. She did not believe in ritual, but sometimes, to enable her to bear her life, she needed the accompaniment of an inward music, and she could not always compose it for herself. That music was God's word of life, and it was to weep over it that she went to church. Lara knew Zhivago, or Yuri, since they were kids, and they will meet again at one point, and they will begin a love affair that continues throughout the story. If you've seen the David Lean film with Julie Christie as Lara, or the miniseries with Keira Knightley, it pretty much follows like the novel, where Lara disappears for long periods of time, and for the viewer or the reader, you just anticipate when she's going to return again. And you know that Zhivago longs for her, and she's what keeps him going during the tragedy of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. Zhivago, as you know, wrote some poems for Lara, and there's 25 of them. And at least for Lara, you could say that, "And life itself is only an instant." That's a line from The Wedding Party, one of the poems. Lara was what compelled me to read this novel a long time ago. I remember I read it in the solarium at a hospital overlooking the bay. It was a while back, and someone I cared for at the time was going through a very difficult time. And spent a lot of time looking at the horizon, reading this book. Lara has a lot of similarities with Dave Sim and Gerhard's Jaka character in CEREBUS. I think that Jaka is the anchor and also the moral compass of the series. 300 issues that were produced between I think 1977 and 2004. And Jaka's story, as the title suggests, was told in issues 114 to 138, and happens to be 25 issues. And each issue, in a way, is a poem. It's one of the most compelling narratives I've read. And briefly, Jaka is a child of privilege. Her uncle is a man named Julius, an eccentric man who rules over a kingdom called Paunu. Jaka, as a child, is cared for by a nurse who is very domineering, controls every aspect of her life. Her only friend is her doll named Missy, and she enjoys riding this wooden horse, where her imagination is free. But at one point, even that is not enough for her, and she has, I'm not saying an epiphany of some kind, but at one point she just gets this idea to dance, and twirled around in a circle, in a dervish. And she feels absolutely free, living her life as a child, only a child can imagine. She suffers an accident, though, and after the accident, for a few years, she is not entirely herself. That's her dancing there. But when she regains her memory, she discovers a room in the vast estate she lives in. And that room, she makes it her own, a room of her own. And at that point, she starts to reclaim her freedom. And by this point, she's a preteen. She's about 10 or 11 years old. And this is this point where she rebels against the nurse, because this is going to be her room. But she will suffer a deep humiliation on her 12th birthday at the expense of her uncle. I mean, as a result of her uncle, who was rather, like I said, rather eccentric man. And she will flee Pelnu. CEREBUS, who is the hero of the story, is aardvark. He is but in this story, Jaka's story, he is more of an observer. I should try to find a picture of him. There he is. And he loves Jaka. CEREBUS loves gold, power, and Jaka. And in our story, he comes back to get her. Now, if one has not read the earlier series, the earlier books, it's not necessary. A good way to begin with this incredible series is to begin with Jaka's story. We have Jaka now, who's an adult, and she's living in a tavern, dancing, but there's no customers there. It's run by this man named Mr. Withers, who lusts after her, and he has these imaginary conversations where he proclaims his love for her. Jaka is married to a man named Rick, who wants to have a son. He wants to have a child. He's unemployed, though, and he keeps looking for a job. Jaka works at this tavern and is paid by Mr. Withers, even though there are no customers. And CEREBUS shows up, and he's living there with him. But unbeknownst to Jaka, her story is being written because there's another guest at the tavern, a man named Oscar, who's a friend of Rick's. And Oscar has a strong resemblance to Oscar Wilde. It is something Sim does throughout his narratives. He takes real-life characters or fictional characters and he puts them in his books. And this man acts and talks like Oscar Wilde. And Rick is telling him Jaka's story, and he's writing it down. And we read it in our story. And pretty much like Zhivago, it's going to have a very difficult story at the end. Because at one point, Jaka will be arrested, and she will suffer. She will now be in another room of her own, but this time it'll be a prison. And the events that lead to this, what happens here, and the conclusion are quite startling. And that affects her in relationship with Rick, her husband. It's rather impressive series in so many ways, on a literary and at a comic level. One of her interrogators, you can see there, her name is Mrs. Thatcher. And yes, she looks and talks like Margaret Thatcher. The book was published between 1988 and 1990. The series was. The issues in question. And it's certainly a story that I go back to quite often. And in recent weeks I've been thinking about Jaka. And Lara from Dr. Zhivago, who's always on my mind. Jaka's Story by Dave Sim and Gerhard. Happy holidays.